Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. Tonight, my guest is Bradley Thompson. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science and the executive director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Magdalene.
So I wanted to have you on because we've had on quite a few people in the education field, homeschoolers, people in charter schools. And I've honestly been a bit disappointed by the charter school people's answers and the philosophy there. But just to start off, what is your education philosophy and how it relates to the American education system?
Great question. So let me just take 2 minutes and sort of lay out for you sort of my own views in the history of my views on the subject. I first became interested in K through 12 education probably sometime in the mid-90s. And I was first involved with the so-called reading wars over how children were taught to read in America's schools. And I became a kind of warrior for traditional phonics versus what was called the whole language or whole word method, which was just one variation of progressive education. And so then I became a critic of progressive education, which is the dominant mode of education that is being taught not only in America's government schools, but also in many, many private schools. And then I also became interested in what was happening in the schools in the light of the Columbine shooting, and then all of the subsequent shootings that took place over Columbine. So what that all led to was I would have described myself up through the early 2000s as a reformist. I wanted to reform American education, and more particularly, I wanted to have progressive education eliminated from America's schools, both government and private. But then one day, I had a kind of epiphany. I was reading James Madison's famous document, the Memorial and Remonstrance, which is a defense of the principle of separation of school and state. And Madison lays out 15 points in defense of the principle of separation of church and state. And it dawned on me, if you take out the word church and substitute the word school, the same argument applies down the line. And immediately I knew that I could no longer be a reformist, but rather I now describe myself as a separationist. That is, I believe in the principle of separation of school and state for the same reasons that I support the principle of separation of church and state. That is, I'll put it the other way around. If you support the principle of separation of church and state, then you must logically, by definition, also support the principle of separation of school and state. And then I took it one step further, and I now consider myself to be an abolitionist. What does that mean? I support abolishing the government school system. Why? Obviously, first, because I support the principle of separation of school and state, but even more fundamentally, because I regard the government school system to be immoral. It's not, so my arguments against government schooling had previously been, it's just not working. They're not delivering a good education. In fact, they're delivering a bad education. But once I became an abolitionist, I opposed government education because I regard the institution itself, by definition, whether it's good or bad, or whether they're delivering a good or a bad education, to be immoral. It's immoral because it relies on the coercive force of the state. It relies on taxation, which is a form of coercion, and it relies on compulsory attendance laws. So for the last, I guess I would say the last just over a decade, maybe 15 years, I've been a separationist and an abolitionist.
And I think that's really interesting because oftentimes in the conservative world, we hear we just need to reform the school system. We just need to change out the teachers or take away power from the unions. And having recently gone through the K through 12 school system, I'm of the opinion that that's not enough, that if you don't gut it out on a curriculum level, nothing's really going to change. So in terms of sort of the trajectory of the reform movement of the education system, Do you think that the reform movement in any way can work? Is there any part of it, if we switch out the teachers, will we have a better school system? Or is our only path forward to really abolish it and start from scratch?
Yeah, the only path forward is, as my t-shirt says, hashtag just walk away. So I do not think reform is possible. So as you know, right now in all over the United States, you have Republican state legislatures trying, for instance, to ban critical race theory or critical gender theory from America's schools. And look, nobody is a greater critic of critical race theory or critical gender theory than I am. There's not a single person in the United States who hates that stuff as much as I do. However, it is not possible to legislate these ideas out of the schools. In fact, I don't think we should be I don't think legislatures, Republican, conservative, or otherwise, should be legislating ideas. That's not the role. That's not the purpose of a legitimate government. But even if you did, and that's what's happening now, it will never succeed. If you think you can ban CRT from the government schools, you're on a fool's errand. You're living in a fantasy world. So the question is, well, why can't you do it? I mean, and there are now lots of laws banning critical race theory because there is something that I call the education deep state. And the education deep state consists of the federal Department of Education, the state departments of education, the teachers' unions, the curriculum designers and textbook publishers, but most importantly, the so-called education schools, right? The teacher training schools. And legislatures can't do anything about any of these institutions, but it's those institutions which determine what is being taught in the classroom and how it is being taught. And even if you ban CRT, it will be taught regardless. They'll change the name, they'll change the form, but it will be taught. And we know this for a fact because since state legislators started banning CRT, all kinds of teachers have gone on Twitter and TikTok, and they have promised publicly that they will continue to teach CRT despite the bans. So that's just one example. But it applies to the broader context. You cannot reform the government schools as long as the teacher training institutions exist as probably the most important example. And the teacher training institutions, the ed schools, as long as they are under the control of the progressive education ideology, which they will be, because the education schools are entirely from top to bottom imbued with progressive education theory. Right. So you can't reform the schools. All right, so that's the first big point. The second point I would say is, all right, so a lot of conservative legislators support both vouchers and charter schools. So the first thing to note, of course, is that charter schools, and there are some decent charter schools, but the fact of the matter is charter schools are government schools.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? They are funded by the government. The only difference between a charter school and a regular government school is that charter schools have greater freedom, to choose whom they hire. They have greater freedom with regard to their curricula. But the fact of the matter is the government could come in any day and change all that. And then the second thing, take vouchers. Vouchers are simply food stamps for education. And the great problem that I have with vouchers is that government influence will always follow government money. Right. And we've already seen this happening with schools that have, like, parochial schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for instance, parochial schools that have taken charters. Parochials. Let me try that one more time. Parochial schools that have taken vouchers now find themselves under government regulation. Right. So what happens, for instance, when a parochial school that takes vouchers is now told by the government that you must hire teachers who have a quote unquote education degree. And if they have an education degree, that means by definition, they have been trained to teach children using the progressive theory of education.
Right.
So I'm actually opposed to vouchers. However, one reform that I would accept and do support would be tuition tax credits. And tuition tax credits for education, they go directly to parents. The government doesn't and can't control, because it's in effect 2 steps removed. It can't control how parents, how they control the education of their children. So I'm open to that. I'm open to tuition tax credits, but ultimately the bottom line is this. Just to repeat, I'm not a reformist. I'm an abolitionist. And ultimately what that means, Magdalene, is that I want to go to a 100% free market in education, right? Think about it this way. To you and to your audience, would any of you want the government controlling what is taught in Sunday school?
Right.
And I've never heard a single person answer, even atheists, I've never heard a single person answer that question in the affirmative.
Yeah.
That yes, we want the government to regulate Sunday school. Well, if you don't want the government to regulate Sunday school, why would you want the government to regulate regular school Monday through Friday?
Yeah, I think that that's a very good point. And a lot of conservatives and Republican politicians have said, well, we'll just have massive homeschooling. And there's been a bit of conflict here where a lot of Republican politicians don't believe that online learning is sustainable. They don't believe that children are going to get the same amount of information they're going to get in person versus online. As someone with a background in education, understanding how it works, do you think that online learning in the homeschooling format, even if there is some sort of involvement from a third party, is it a sustainable model going forward if people cannot simply just have, if people are not willing to stay in government schools or even in parochial schools? Is that something that can deliver a real level of education for young people?
Well, the one thing I know, right? So if it were a high quality online education, so for instance, you can get a kind of world-class education online. I'm sure you can also get a really bad education online. But what I'm also certain of is that nothing would be as bad as sending your children to a government school. Right. I mean, the government schools are both an intellectual and a moral abomination.
Right.
And so if your children are at home getting an online education, sure, there will be, you can get a world-class online education. Imagine being a homeschooler living in rural Alaska, and you're living in a cabin in rural Alaska. Through the internet now and various education platforms, you can take a physics course. So let's assume you're a 17-year-old Alaskan homeschooler living on the frontier. You can get a world-class physics education by an MIT professor online, right? So there are platforms where you can take college, university level courses with some of the world's best teachers or professors online. And there are all kinds of curriculum services, certainly in the homeschooling world now, there are all kinds of curriculum services that are online. And the thing is, online education is getting better and better. With every passing year, online education is getting better. And, and the other thing is, we shouldn't just assume that we shouldn't assume that online education as it exists today will be what it will be in 5 years. It's getting better and better and better. Now, do I think it's the best kind of education? No, probably not. But the great thing about education freedom, and this is particularly true of homeschoolers, right, is that it's eclectic. That is, homeschoolers. I mean, my wife and I, we homeschooled our 3 children for 18 years. And certainly by the time they were in high school, they were getting their education delivered through a variety of different means. Some of it was the old-fashioned traditional sitting around the kitchen table. Some of it was online. Some of it was through a homeschool co-op. And my wife and I, we stopped homeschooling 5 years ago after our youngest went off to college. But just in the last 5 years, just in the last 2 years, think about how homeschooling has evolved with these education pods and micro schools, right? So, I certainly think at the very least, online education can be a supplement to homeschoolers or people who are seeking education alternatives.
That definitely makes sense. So for people who are politically involved and are trying to advocate for their child, or trying to push a politician one way or the other, what can they push their representatives to do on an education front? Because like you said, even if you ban CRT, all these other types of curriculum, it's the way that these teachers think that is influencing everything. It's going to seep in some way or another. So what can people advocate for their politicians or representatives to do on a practical level to have some sort of influence or some sort of positive effect in their school systems?
The single most important thing they can do, without question, is to get state legislators to take away the authority to license teachers from the so-called education schools, right? No school in America should be required to hire so-called licensed teachers who are trained through the education schools. The government should not be involved in licensing teachers. Principals, high school, let's say high school or middle or elementary school principals, they should be able to hire whomever they want based on their own standards and criteria. So let me give you a very concrete example of what I'm talking about. Many years ago, I taught, I had a class in American political thought. 50% of the class were so-called education majors. And I had one student in particular who was a horrible student, and he was a graduating senior. It was second semester, senior year. He was a horrible student, one of the worst students I've ever had. And this kid could not write worth a darn. And at the end of the semester, when he realized that he was going to get a D in my class, which was a gift, he came into my office and he threw his last paper down on my desk which had an F on it. And he demanded to know why he got an F. I very calmly explained to him why he got an F. And then he picked up his paper, stormed out of my office, and his last words to me were, "Who cares if I can't write?" Now, 2 months later, that young man was going to be a teacher in the local high school. And I, who have an Ivy League PhD, I'm not qualified. At that time, I was not qualified to teach in the school where he just got a job. Now, what's wrong with this picture? I mean, obviously, that's entirely absurd. So that's why it's really important for principals to be able to hire the people that they think are the best teachers. So you also have to ask the question, what are the qualifications to be a great teacher? And the qualifications to be a great teacher do not include taking courses, as they do in the education colleges, in bulletin board design, right? To be a great teacher, to be a great classroom teacher, you need primarily 2 things. You need a knowledge of the subject, which you can only get by taking courses in the subject that you're teaching. So if you're going to be a history teacher or a science teacher or a math teacher, rather than being an education major and taking courses in bulletin board design, you should have a major in history or physics or English literature, right? Depending on what you want to teach. That's what's most important. The second most important quality of great teachers is that they have to have a love and a passion for the subject that they're teaching.
Right.
But the only way you get a love and a passion for the subject you're teaching is if you've studied the subject you're teaching.
Yes.
Right? Rather than, once again, taking courses in bulletin board design.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that many times in the classroom, I saw this in my AP history classes, my teacher knew the AP curriculum inside and out, but knew nothing of what was currently happening in the world and global affairs. So if you have a question in real time, no one's going to be able to answer it. And if they are, you're likely just going to get the hard left perspective on that answer. Just sort of in closing, I feel that there's a bit of stagnation when it comes to approaching the education issue within the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Going forward, do you see any political leaders that you think have the right idea, either on the left or the right, or independent leaders, about how to tackle the education issue in this country, or at least are bringing attention to the fact that we're no longer really globally competitive on the education stage?
That's a great question, and it's a hard question to answer. So part of me wants to say no. I see very few people, almost no one out there. I certainly don't see Republican politicians who have the right views on education. I mean, obviously, the conservative Republicans are better than left-wing Democrats on education issues, but still, the problem is Republicans are all right. So here's the way to think about it. Conservative Republicans are closer to far left-wing Democrats on the education issue than they are to me, right? Because they accept the premise, they accept the philosophic premise that there is a right to an education delivered by the government.
Right.
The principle which I reject entirely. So no, I don't see any good really coming from conservative Republican politicians. Now, on the flip side, what's the good news that's happening? The good news that's happening is, what's been happening for the last year and a half, in part, ironically, because of COVID. I mean, America's young people have really barely received any kind of an education for the last year and a half because the government education is bad enough, but government education delivered via the internet or online
Zoom calls.
Yeah, a Zoom call, exactly. It's been just a complete and total nightmare. Now, on the other hand, something really important has resulted from this horrible development, and that is ordinary, everyday, regular moms and dads, for the first time, have been able to peek into the classroom experience of their children. And what they've learned has shocked and horrified them, right? And as a result, you now have thousands, maybe tens of thousands of ordinary, everyday Americans who are now showing up to school board meetings and asking school board members a lot of really tough questions. And it's even more than that, obviously. There is a kind of parental revolt that is taking place right now. And for the last year and a half, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, I don't know the exact numbers, of parents have been #JustWalkAway. They've been pulling their kids out of the government schools and either homeschooling them or putting them in private or parochial schools. So I would say that in my adult lifetime, the single most important development in education is the fact that lots of Americans are now, for the first time, really seeing how bad, how corrupt, how bankrupt the government schools are, and they're actually doing something about it. Now, I will say that the cutting edge for this is, you know this, but your audience might know this. Right now, the cutting edge movement to lead this education revolution will be found at the blog or the website edwatchdaily.com. edwatchdaily.com, one word. And EdWatch Daily is the one and only website in the United States, maybe in the world right now, that is taking the purest, most principled stand against government schooling and against the so-called reformists on the conservative Republican side. EdWatch Daily is making the argument every single day for separation of school and state, and for abolishing the government schools, and for a free market in education.
It certainly is. And as someone who posts there, I can attest to that. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you to keep up with your work and learn more about your resources?
Well, they can find a lot of my writing, particularly on education matters, at my Substack, which is cbradleythompson.com, all one word, cbradleythompson.com. I'm otherwise known at Substack as the Redneck Intellectual, and you can find me by Googling the Redneck Intellectual. And then, of course, at EdWatch Daily, that's EdWatch Daily, all one word, edwatchdaily.com.
Perfect. And we'll link all that below. Thank you so much for coming on.
Magdalene, thank you so much. Have a great day.